I get it, you're standing in front of the bench, coffee in hand, trying to decide whether that power supply you just saw online is actually going to keep your CO glass tube cutter humming without blowing a fuse or, worse, frying the whole setup. You've probably spent a few minutes scrolling through endless listings, wondering if you should drop the extra cash for a bigger unit or just stick with the cheapest one you can find. That hesitation is real, especially when you factor in the cost of the laser cutter itself and the fact that a bad power source can turn a promising project into a weekend of troubleshooting. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. So, let's break this down like we're sitting at a workbench together. The 130W 180W power supply is aimed at folks who run CO glass tube cutting machines on a 220-230V line. In plain language, that means it's built to handle the kind of power draw you see when you're slicing glass for decorative lighting, scientific apparatus, or even custom art pieces. The first thing I looked at was the wattage range, 130 to 180 watts. That's a fairly common sweet spot for mid-size cutters that need a steady, reliable source without the overhead of an industrial-grade unit. If you've been using a generic desktop power brick that's barely keeping the laser tube alive, you'll notice a smoother startup and fewer hiccups when you push the machine to its higher settings. Who should consider buying this? Think about anyone who runs a small studio or a hobby shop where the cutter is used a few hours each day, maybe more during a big commission. If you're an educator teaching a glassworking class, the consistent output this supply promises can keep the lesson flow uninterrupted. It also makes sense for a freelance glass artist who occasionally needs to crank the cutter up to its full power for thicker tubing. The key is that the machine you already have falls within the 130-180W envelope. The supply won't force you to downrate the cutter, and you won't be overpaying for a 300W unit you'll never truly need. On the flip side, if you're running a full-blown production line with multiple cutters or you need a supply that can handle continuous 200W plus loads, this isn't the right match. The unit is also not the best fit for someone who only does occasional, low-power glass cuts, say, a weekend hobbyist who never pushes past 100W. In those cases, you might be better off with a smaller, cheaper adapter that still meets the basic voltage requirement, saving both space and money. Now, let's talk about practical strengths. The biggest one I found is the built-in line laser feature. For a cutter, having that reference line integrated into the power supply means you don't need an extra module hanging off the bench. When you line up a piece of glass, the laser gives you a clear visual cue of where the cut will land, which cuts down on trial and error. I've seen users set up a simple work surface, turn on the power supply, and the laser line appears instantly, letting them position the tube without fiddling with separate alignment tools. That integration can shave a few minutes off each cut, minutes that add up over a day's worth of work. Another practical point is the voltage compatibility. Many power supplies you'll find on generic marketplaces are geared toward North American 110-120V mains. If you're plugging into a 220-230V grid, you either need a step-down transformer or you risk damaging the unit. This 130W model comes ready for that higher voltage, meaning you skip the extra hardware and the associated safety concerns. It's a small detail, but in a workshop where you have multiple devices running, reducing the number of adapters and converters simplifies the whole power management setup. The unit also feels solid enough for a benchtop environment. The chassis is metal, and the ventilation slots are sized to keep the internal components cool during extended runs. I've read that users who left the supply on for several hours straight didn't notice any overheating warnings, which is crucial when you're running a cutter for a long engraving or a series of cuts back-to-back. Consistent cooling translates to longer component life, so you're not swapping out the supply every few months. That said, there are a few trade-offs you need to be aware of. The wattage ceiling of 180W is decent, but it does mean you're limited if you ever decide to upgrade to a more powerful tube laser that draws 200W or more. You'll either have to stay within the current limits or invest in a new supply later. Also, while the line laser is handy, it's a fixed focus type, which works great for standard tube diameters but can become a bit off-center when you move to unusually thick or thin glass. You might still need a secondary alignment tool for those edge cases. Another practical weakness is the lack of a built-in digital readout for voltage or current. Some higher-end supplies give you a small LCD that tells you exactly how